Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. We are here with a special guest, Thomas Desmond, and I'm Chris Lucian, and this is Austin Chadwick, and welcome to the show. We have lots to talk about today. So one thing I wanted to get into was recently you had a conference talk, and in that you had covered a few topics. So maybe you can introduce the name of the conference, the talk that you just did, and how it relates to mob programming.
Yeah, so just about a week or two ago, I was at the Pacific Northwest Software Quality Conference, and there I gave a talk titled Creating Quality with Mob Programming. The talk actually came with a research paper as well, so there's a research paper titled that as well, and I talked about a lot of the different benefits that I saw in mobbing, and some of those were reducing stress, the elevated learning, and getting my questions answered immediately.
Nice. So maybe we can dig into those topics a little bit. Does any one of those stand out to you immediately as something that you want to talk about right away?
We can start with the reduced stress.
Yeah.
I think just mobbing, different from more traditional development, for me there's a lot of stress reduction, and the biggest reason for that is just that we're working as a group, we're working with a team of people that all have brilliant ideas, and we can share and exchange ideas. There's not this feeling of just me being alone in the development process. I can bounce ideas off all my teammates, and really talk to my peers and get the best ideas out there. And at least in traditional development, it wasn't uncommon for me to leave the office at 5 o'clock, not knowing what I'm going to do the next day, coming in at 8 a.m., looking at my computer and just, wow, I still don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how to complete this task. That was just really stressful, and in mobbing, at least I have a lot of different people to bounce ideas off of, and I never feel like I'm alone in developing a feature.
Yeah, so, that's a really good point, is that in that situation where you kind of feel stuck while doing software development, if the task is totally unknown to you, you don't really know how long it'll take you to finish it out, and that kind of sense of like maybe not delivering can be really stressful and escalates over time, and can destroy kind of your ability to keep calm
exactly
over time as well, right?
Yeah. And a couple things come to mind for me. One is doing traditional development and then mobbing. There were two factors that kind of prohibited me from reducing that stress. Because when you're doing traditional solo development, what they say is, oh, well, if you're not sure, go talk to somebody, right? But then you're always interrupting someone else and you feel bad about it, right? And so
exactly,
even though I would do it, I always be like, well, I'm interrupting their flow. So more flow state, you're causing more interruptions because you have people having to do more context switching, where with mobbing, everyone's in the same flow, and so it just it's nicer, and also you don't feel like you're interrupting someone in your own mob to share an idea with them, or hopefully not. So.
Exactly. So it's just the idea of having other people around you at all times. Even I'll express like a half-baked idea, and just to put it out there, just to get the idea other people thinking, and so I don't even have to have a full idea yet, and it can bounce off others and really expand and make it a full idea.
Yeah, so the innovation and kind of the shepherding of the idea from just a minor thought to all the way into a full-fledged feature and beyond happens because everybody's there together focusing on the same thing at the same time, same place.
Yeah,
exactly.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this reminds me of something you said the other day when you were talking about decision fatigue, and so how mobbing can help bear the load of decision fatigue. Do you want to go into that a little bit? Yeah, because
I think topic. So there was like there are the popular studies about decision fatigue. One of them is like prosecutors or parole officers basically allowing for parole to be granted. And essentially over the course of the day, this study showed that these judges had a habit of basically taking the less risky option more often throughout the day. And so people that went up for parole in the beginning of the day would actually have a much higher chance of actually being granted parole than by the end of the day. And it's because you have to make a lot of these decisions over and over again. And so there's a lot of science around decision fatigue and a lot of studies around it. And it kind of just says that it's kind of a muscle that can be worn out over time. And so if you have 4 people together trying to make the right decision together, then you can do that. And so I think particularly in the example of stress, what's interesting and what I've seen over the years is the decision to write a unit test is actually a really tough thing for a solo developer. It's like, do I learn how to do this right now? Do I, yes, I'm going to do it, but maybe I'm feeling bad right now, so I'm not going to do it. What happens in a mob that I've seen over the years is that because you're together, you kind of have that shared ability to make those decisions together, and that strength together actually is much greater than that strength alone. And so what'll happen is I think people just in general make better choices when they're in a group of people, because one day you might be feeling bad and be like, I don't think I want to write that unit test, but then somebody else would be like, actually I think we should, and then you do. And so it's kind of like that collective conscious is actually strengthened by the fact that you're in a group. You don't eat the comfort food when it's there, when people are there watching you, right? Like that sort of thing, right? So
Yeah.
that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Nice.
Awesome.
So moving on to one of the other things you said was
I think questions answered could be good. You kind of touched on this of the idea that everyone in the group is sharing the same context, so you feel more encouraged to ask questions. You feel like you're disrupting less. So yeah, previous companies, I'd be like, oh man, I've already asked John 5 questions today. I don't want to bug him again. I don't want to force him to have to context switch, get distracted. He has his own features he's supposed to be working on. So I can feel in the mob, I'm encouraged to ask questions. We're sharing the same context. I feel like I'm not disrupting as much. And that really can... I have lots of questions when I'm programming. And it even makes sure that everyone on the mob is sharing the same context and has the same understanding. So that's been really helpful, is just getting questions answered immediately and feeling encouraged to ask as many questions as possible.
Yeah. And that's a big thing too, is we talk a lot about like the Socratic method and just like digging into to reasons for things, and also shifting people's like worldview around that. And so it's a great environment when that's safe. It can be really beneficial, right? And so this idea that you're all working together on the same thing and asking questions to the point where you can improve a design through the question asking, I see that happening a lot. And so just basically, it can be anything from just gaining understanding all the way to just asking a question that can't be answered rhetorically because the path that is currently being embarked on maybe doesn't make sense. And so it's a lot easier to do that in that environment because you don't have to call a meeting together and get everybody together and talk about it. It's like, hey, this thing that we're working on right now together has that ability.
Yeah, there's fewer formal meetings and a lot... There's still informal meetings, but we're already sitting next to each other, already talking. Don't need to book a conference room. We just start talking with whiteboards there for us to draw on. So yeah, it's really, really great environment.
Nice. So does that lead to elevated learning?
Yeah, so this all kind of brings it into elevated learning. In any industry, especially in tech, there's always new language, new framework. There's always something that we can be learning. And by having my questions answered immediately and with reduced stress as well, it really brings in a really great learning environment altogether.
And through that learning, you can produce things that you would have never been able to produce before, especially when you're working in a siloed environment and you don't have time for that learning. A lot of the times you just have to deliver on what you know already instead of increasing your capabilities through the day. Right?
Yeah. And to go with the elevated learning as well, the driver navigator model that we follow really helps with that. If I learn a new design pattern that I'd like to implement into the code, I can navigate the rest of the team on that. Then they learn everything that I've learned. They can then navigate and learn from it. So the driver navigator model really helps us share the knowledge that we have as well, so that the rest of the team can improve as well.
Yeah. And that brings a phrase to mind, and maybe you can help clarify who came up with it. Optimized for learning? I don't know where that got from.
Organizations, optimized for learning. Well, yeah, so I guess like in the past I talked about this idea of essentially if you don't optimize for learning, then your capability stagnates over time. And so a lot of what will happen is, you know, you might have people with more free time outside of work will typically end up spending more time learning outside of work. And usually that's people that have less experience in the industry. And so what ends up happening is somebody that's more senior ends up getting more responsibilities through their life and having to take care of things over time. And so they have the ability to learn less and less over time. And so what happens is the people that have the greatest capability for maybe implementing your new UI framework actually has the least amount of time to learn it, and the people that are capable of implementing that new UI framework have the least amount of experience, and so we have a disconnect, and that makes people defensive. So optimizing for learning has a lot of great benefits, you know, whether or not you're mobbing, right?
Yeah, and I feel like optimizing for learning optimizes for efficiency in the mid to long run, because like you said, you can get your questions answered, where before, I don't want to bother, you know, this guy again for the 10th time today, where you can just ask in the mob. And I don't know if anytime I do solo coding, I'll get that feeling like, I bet there's a better way, right? But in a mob, you can just kind of raise it. But alone, it's just like, no, I don't want to bother him again, or there's no one to ask right now, so I just keep going the slower way, you know? And, and often there is a better way.
You're stuck in the make it work.
Yeah.
I think the like hours of Googling just doesn't necessarily happen as often, or one mob member does the hours of Googling and then brings it back to the team, and so kind of what I talked about before, the steamroller effect happens because of that. You know, basically the mob, you know, sometimes it may feel slow, but it always moves forward. It doesn't get stuck, and I think that's a lot about what we talked about here is just that the mob is kind of like a steamroller.
Right on. Next topic.
Yeah.
Let's talk multi-mob versus solo mobs.
Yeah, I think this is my favorite topic on this list right now.
Yeah.
And so maybe we can expand on it, but I think that you and I had talked a lot in the past about this topic in particular. And I think you've written a couple blogs on it too, right?
Yes. So yeah, I have experience being on a multi-mod project where we have 2 or more mobs working on a single project, as well as another one where it was just 3 of us in a single mob doing all of the development. And there was a lot of different kind of pieces that came into that. Overall, I think the single mob aspect was really nice because then you actually developed all of the software. Every piece, every decision was you and your teammates in the single mob working together, developing the entire code base. So that was actually really rewarding, being able to do that. But then again, for 2 years, I worked with the same 3 people, so there's stagnating that can happen there. There's definitely some patterns and practices that we got into the habit of that might not have been the best habits. Whereas now, I'm actually on a multi-mob. There's usually 2 mobs working on the project, and there's just a lot more learning going on. There's more progress going on. But the downside is that you don't get to see all the features. You don't get to implement everything. You might switch mobs in the middle of a feature. And that's just something to consider, is how kind of the sense of accomplishment when you don't do everything and you do have to just allow this other team to take the code forward on their own, which is it's going to be very common in a traditional software environment, but it's just kind of different to experience writing everything for the software versus sharing that with a multi-mob team.
When working in that way, I guess have you seen any relationship to kind of Conway's law emerging out of that? So like the code base reflecting the communication patterns of the team working on it.
I'm not sure if I understand the question though. Yeah.
So I think go ahead.
So Conway's law, I believe, is the code, whatever communication patterns the people have in the team and the organization will show up in the code?
Yeah.
Okay.
As architectural decisions.
Yes.
I'm not sure if it really answers your question as much, but I guess on the multi-mob project, there's a lot more communication that does have to happen, where we just kind of have to do, not maybe necessarily formal stand-ups, but there's a lot more sharing and just expanding our knowledge of who's working on what projects. But what's really important to us, at least on our team, is about every Monday, so once a week, we switch who's on the teams. So we actually rotate who's working on the different projects. And that really helps get everyone to have an idea of where the code is going and has a piece in all of the different architecture. So that's an important concept for our team, is being able to kind of rotate who's on the mobs and sharing the knowledge and sharing the experience.
And I think that kind of plays into Conway's law, because I've been on a multi-mob where it was much more stagnant in the sense of who is in each mob. Mm-hmm. And you could see patterns on the code that each mob developed. You know what I mean? It'd be like, you come into a file and you're like, oh, I know that mob developed that, just by the look and feel of the code. And you could see certain practices, certain amounts of refactoring or testing, depending upon which mob it was.
Yeah. And so I've seen teams, and I've heard stories from other teams where, multi-mob environments lead to microservices patterns where one mob works on one piece that's completely decoupled from the other piece, and they talk over communication protocols, and even though they're on the same team, those different pieces talk to each other, and very similar to how often or strongly related to how often their mobs talk to each other even on the same project. And so that's just a pattern that I noticed over time, which is why I bring it up, because I'm always interested to hear people's experience with the way that pieces of your application communicate with each other when they're distinctly separate.
Yeah.
Do they behave similarly to the way that your mob operates, like that sort of thing?
Yeah.
So, just curiosity.
I think I have seen that when we have been working in a more microservice type way. Mm-hmm. When it was a monolith, it's a little more muddy, I feel like, but yeah.
And so rotating through on a monolith makes a lot of sense, and then maybe when decoupling to microservices makes a lot more sense when you're doing single mobs. And probably serverless means that maybe every mob can work on anything, right?
Yeah.
It'd be kind of interesting.
Yeah. I had a follow-up question for you on that, because it's been a recent experience for me to go from multi-mobs to recently 2-3-person mobs on 2 different teams.
Yeah.
And so one thing I noticed is, at least the way we multi-mobbed, it had a lot more moving parts, right? So there's a lot more communication channels, right? So you have does each mob retro individually and then retro all together? And then how do you have working agreements between all the mobs? And in this case, it was different from your example because it was more stagnant mobs. Each mob kind of had their own norms, but then we had to form norms for the whole thing. And then going from that to just a 3-person mob for one product, it was just way simpler. You know what I mean? To change our processor to do anything, and it was less talking and that kind of thing. So I was interested in your experiences in doing both worlds.
Yeah, and there's a lot more communication that has to happen on the multi-mobs. Not only just because there are multi-mobs, but we have a lot more people on the team. When I was in the single project, it was really easy to learn. I knew exactly how to talk to my teammates, what best ways to drive and navigate them through the code. Whereas in multi-mob, there's just a lot more communication that does have to happen to learn about what skill level your different teammates are at. When you're creating working agreements, we have it at a project level. But we have been doing, what's really helpful is the kind of mini retros, or at least check-ins, I would probably call them, at the individual mob level. And those have really helped in just building the team throughout the week and making sure that we're all in the same shared context as well.
Nice.
Right on. Okay, and I kind of, to move the topic on a little bit, I know that you had some teaching experience, and during that time you used mobbing for doing some level of teaching. So what does mob programming look like with a group of students?
Yeah, so I was teaching a mobile development class to students, and they came in with zero mobile development knowledge. This was an upper division course, so at least they're usually in their 3rd or 4th year of their undergraduate program. But we had a classroom set up for mobbing. They had about 8 mobbing stations set up in the classroom. So there were five or so students per mob or per group. And I would generally kind of set up labs for them to do as a mob. I would lecture for the first half so they can gain some knowledge. And then they would mob in the second half, doing a lab sort of format where they'd be able to learn and just experiment and try new things themselves. And I think the best thing that came out of it was the experimentation, because there was a group saying what if we tried changing the button to this color? What if we tried adding a new event in here? So there was a lot more experimentation and a lot more just trying new things when they were as a mob. Because I got put into different classrooms later on that weren't really conducive to mobbing. And I felt like the learning and experimentation did go down, so it was a lot more fun when I was able to mob in the classroom, and the students really enjoyed it as well. So it was a lot of fun being able to put that into an education setting.
Did you feel like grades were better after mobbing versus not mobbing?
I don't know. The grades were about the same, but
Okay.
I think it was more fun to teach as a mob because one of the best parts was I didn't get bothered as much. Like,
nice.
there were less questions for me. I ended up having to implement a rule of do not ask me a question until you've asked a student or a fellow student as well. But when mobbing, there was a lot more interaction and just sharing of their knowledge together.
Nice.
So that was nice when they could ask each other their questions first rather than me.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, did you have to get approval or anything? Did you just basically this is my class, I'm doing it this way?
I kind of went for it. There was a lot of just freedom to experiment and freedom to teach the class. Students needed to come up with a mobile app by the end of the class, and they were successful in that. They all worked in groups and did a group project creating mobile apps, so it was a lot of fun, and there was a lot of freedom to experiment and really teach.
Yeah, so one thing that I noticed when I was doing my master's degree was I was walking around the campus that I was at, and I noticed that the computer science labs were all set up just side by side, and so everybody had to kind of sit next to each other and program. It was really hard to sit next to each other, so you couldn't even pair really, and then they were like rows after rows, so you couldn't actually sit back far enough to be able to mob. But what I noticed is in the business classes, all the rooms were set up in such a way that they had 4 chairs around a table with a big screen monitor at the end of the table, because they have to do some kind of debate prep, and they have one kind of research thing up there. It turns out it was the perfect environment for mobbing, and so that's kind of my recommendation, is that if you're at a university and you're in a computer science area that doesn't adjust for it well, try looking around at some of the other stations and see whether or not you can find a good space for mobbing.
Yeah, right on. Any feedback from the students on, because they probably did all the other classes, solo programming. Did you have any?
A lot of them they really enjoyed mobbing. They enjoyed being able to work together. They liked that group atmosphere and being encouraged to do it. They weren't allowed to cheat. They weren't supposed to share their homeworks, but a lot of the lab work and a lot of at least the final group project, they did it as a mob, and that was I think they really enjoyed that and thought it was a good process to do. Yeah. Did
you just like come in and say, hey, we're gonna mob it, or was it kind of optional? They could go solo if they wanted, or
It was optional. It was definitely encouraged. I had some students who just didn't want to be a part of a group, didn't want to do that, so I didn't force them into anything. That's how they wanted to learn. But a vast majority of the students really caught on and wanted to mob and work together in groups.
Cool. All right on. Well, before we close out the show, is there anything you'd like to share that you're working on, or?
So I am working on a video course right now on Thinkster. There's going to be a C# course on creating an API with ASP.NET Core. So you can check that out on Thinkster soon. It should be available pretty soon.
And also he does blog. So this true story. Yeah. So the other day I was just looking for an article on Make It Work, Make It Right, Make It Fast from Kent Beck.
Yeah.
And his showed up as one of the top results. Nice. His blog post. And I was like, I know this guy.
Yeah. Check me out at thetombomb.com.
Nice.
Yeah. My blog is there. I'm trying to be pretty active with it. It's been a lot of fun.
So just to wrap up, I think that, again, this is kind of the message that I've been saying at the very end of all of these. If you think that this episode could really help somebody that you know and in a situation that they need this information in, be sure to share it with them, because I think that sharing these ideas can really be helpful, and it's kind of why we're doing the show. So, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.
See ya.
Bye, everybody. Next time.